Push to increase the GST. Let's have a look. Hello everyone, Florian.Heise here and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. Still finishing up my morning stein of coffee, as you can see. And I thought we'd have a look at this analysis from the ABC, discussing, well, everyone's favourite topic, more taxes. More taxes. Fantastic. 20 years now, the GST. 20 years. So you've got people in the workforce, in university, who don't even remember a life without a GST. Is it time to increase the tax rate or broaden the base? Remember all the debate about that? Remember, the first homeowners, buyers scheme that they put in the beginning was to offset the cost of GST. Boom! You instantly have an increase in housing cost. Weren't they meant to get rid of stamp duty to offset that in all the states? Did that happen? Remember, they said GST will never increase. I mean, this is the problem. This is the problem. Let's have a look. Can you tell I love doing my best? It was 20 years ago today that the GST was introduced, and it was the dawn of a new taxation era for Australians. After decades of being on and off the table, John Howard took it to an election, which he narrowly won, and scraped it through the Senate, because he had to. The forced removal of some taxes on alcohol, fuel and cigarettes punched a huge hole in government revenue, but the compromises made to get the GST across the line have meant it has never raised as much as intended. Now the pandemic means government budgets, federal and state, are hemorrhaging. So, 2 decades on, is it now time to lift the GST, apply it to everything, both or neither? Never any discussion of reducing tax. Never any discussion of, well, it's the ABC, of course. I mean, it's a tax-funded organization. There's going to be an inherent bias in everything they produce. We've had the pandemic and there's a lot of churn and tumult in the economy, former Prime Minister Howard told the ABC News. What does that mean for economic reform? Some people argue it's an ideal opportunity. And this is the problem. I agree, it is an ideal opportunity for economic reform. But where is it going to head? Is it going to be a more interventionist reform into the economy? More restrictions on your freedoms, more taxation, more money taken away from you. Just think about this. Taxes are a reduction in your quality of life. It's just that simple. Previous generations didn't have these burdens. They didn't have the same burdens. Mr. Howard and Peter Costello's plan for the GST was for everything to be subject to the tax, including fresh food. But politics got in the way, and so fresh food was exempt, along with health and education. GST now raises around $70 billion a year, which is about 13% of Australia's total tax haul. It is well short of what it could be, and has been in decline since it was introduced, thanks to our spending habits. More on housing, education and health, less on GST attracting frippery. So, we're not, it's not really an improvement in our spending habits. It means we're being forced to spend more on housing, education and health. People can't buy toys and luxury items. Or, clothing. Or people are looking at offshore opportunities to save money. In the coming years, GST review will see a far sharper decline than it did in the GFC. GST revenue. In coming years, GST revenue will see a far sharper decline than it did during the GFC. It's a big problem for the states. The GST is a key source of funding to pay for schools, hospitals and everything else. For New South Wales, it is just over 20% of the total income, but in Tasmania it is around 40%. Oh well. Means the states will have to cut costs. That's what happens in business. If your revenue falls, you find new ways to generate revenue, which is what they're going to do, or you cut back. Everyone else has to cut back. Every household in the country has to cut back. Everyone who's unemployed has to cut back. Every business who was forced to lock down has to cut back. Maybe the states should cut back. But think of the children, Florian. Think of the schools. There's a lot of waste in schools, people. There's a lot of waste in schools. What about the hospitals, all the dying people? There's a lot of waste in hospitals too. New South Wales leads the push to change GST. New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perotti is the latest state leader to make a big push for a change to the GST. It is not broad, right across the board, and it has a shrinking base that makes it challenging. And it's also going to make it a greater problem for funding the states into the future. We don't just have an opportunity to reform in this pandemic, we have an obligation to, and to set our states and country for future generation. Oh, great. They're just... Here's the thing. There's no political will for reform, which I would advocate for less intervention. You know, I mean, Labour and Liberal, they're both interventionists. There's very little difference between them. Mr. Perotta is today releasing a review into the tax system and hoping it will receive the support of interstate colleagues. It is likely to propose beefing up the GST in exchange for abolishing other taxes like payroll tax, vehicle registration fees, and possibly stamp duty. It won't happen. They'll creep them back in, one way or another. They always do. I like the LDP policy of having a half-life on taxes and legislation. It's also likely to recommend introducing a broad-based land tax, of course, to replace the revenue lost from abolishing stamp duty, an idea he has previously floated. Wouldn't you love that? You know, paying a yearly tax on your house as well. They just got to get you, don't they? The scrapping of some taxes in exchange for a bigger GST is supported by ANU's Professor Robert Burung and the Grattan Institute. These are tough conversations, but one that will drive better efficiencies and better outcomes. It will also be a tough call. Stamp duty in New South Wales accounts for 13% of the state's revenue, so it will require a significant lift in other taxes to fill that budget hole. How should the GST birthday cake be taxed? So if the GST needs to be increased, no, it doesn't. It doesn't need to be increased. Government could cut services. But government can't cut services for him. We're so dependent on the state taking care of us. Here's the thing. There's plenty of room to broaden it. The tax office's list on which what is and not exempt from GST are long and incredibly complex. For food alone, the list is 88 pages long with 45 separate rules regarding cakes and their decorations. I mean, this is utterly ludicrous. It just shows you how complicated our tax system is. We need to simplify tax. We need to drastically simplify tax. And we need to cut. Government needs to cut back its spending. It shouldn't be the biggest employer in a nation. Government doesn't create jobs. Government transfers wealth from one group of people to another. They don't create anything. There will be some comfort to John Hewson, who lost the unlosable election over the GST, in part because of an infamous interview where he could not explain how the tax would apply to a birthday cake. It's made more complicated because it's not on everything. If it was on everything, you wouldn't have disputes about whether a biscuit is a food or not a food. The Institute argues that broadening the GST to include all food, health and education will be more efficient and reduce costs for businesses. It's gonna hurt the average punter. 10% increase on everything overnight of all your food costs. How's that going to affect the quality of life of people? This is the thing. This is going to tax. They love this tax. It taxes the poorest the most. They're going to feel it the most. A consumption tax. Sure, if they offset other things, other costs. What about cutting fuel excise in half? But I agree, it is complicated. It is a pain. It is a pain. It will also capture more spending by wealthier people, who are more likely to spend on private education and health. But the idea has not won over his southern counterparts. We know that we're going to see increased difficulties in the community, so I don't think now is the time to talk about massive disruptions to the settings, Victoria's Treasurer Tim Pallas said. A 15% GST would raise an extra $30 billion, and how much of it are they going to waste? How about we look at addressing all of the waste in the state before we look at imposing more tax increases on the citizenry? Yeah, what about all our foreign aid? We can't afford it. Nope. When we're looking at taxing people on food, why the hell are we sending money offshore? When pensioners would have to pay tax to eat. Is this what Australia is coming to now? Australia's rate of 10% is well below the OECD average of 19%. Increasing the rate to 15 would generate an additional 30 billion. How about we take that 30 billion out of the ABC? Oh, well, no, we can't. There are only 3 billion. Well, cut $1 billion off it, then we won't need to put the tax so high. Right there. There you go. Cut their budget. Privatize it. Sell it off. Get rid of SBS. So we don't have to tax food. Concerns that a higher GST... Just think about this. If they put this on food, the healthier food is going to get more expensive. So the poorer people will eat crap, so their health conditions will worsen. There'll be more demand on our healthcare system. We need to put up the GST because the hospitals are failing. It's a never-ending cycle of intervention and stuff-ups. I'm getting sick of it. Concerns that a higher GST would hit those who can least afford it could be alleviated by putting some of the extra money raised into beefing up the welfare system. No, we're running at a loss now. Why would you put it more? You tax more people and then you put it into welfare, so you create less incentive to people to work. Then you have to put up minimum wages to offset this, and it's a never-ending cycle. This is not going to help Australia. Bloody... Oh. Sorry, everyone. I'm getting a little annoyed. The Institute has suggested spending about 30% of the additional revenue from a 15% GST on increasing welfare payments, which would leave 2/3 of low-income households better off overall. With budget deficits heading into the hundreds of billions of dollars, governments need to do something now. The fallout from the pandemic provides the opportunity to make the new bold move. Yeah, let's just degenerate into a socialist shithole. Politicians remain weary about the GST. But who will be brave enough to tinker with the GST? What about getting rid of it and reducing... They don't... Florian, stop it. They don't think like that. No, they do not think like that. They just want to grow their little bloody empires. When asked about it this week, Commonwealth Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said the government's focus has been on cutting taxes, recognising that tax reform is one of the key areas we need to drive forward. Prime Minister Morrison this week dodged the question after declaring last year we're not doing it. The Treasurer was being more pragmatic. We all had the opportunity to shed ourselves of our doctrinal positions, that's what they are, because of the pandemic or our response to it, he told the ABC. There is an obligation on all politicians, all governments, all political parties to walk that extra mile for possibilities of consensus. New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perrottier is hopeful that his federal and state counterparts will want to write themselves into the history books. I think the history books shine brightly on Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello era. The reforms that they achieved set our country up for 30 years of economic prosperity. Sure it did. The reality is today we need to be looking at what those reforms are and what we can do. Mr. Howard believes changes could be made because he's already done the heavy lifting. It's not as if that one big reform is still there to be tackled, he argued. It's a question of whether incrementally at the right time certain changes can be made. And that's up to the government to decide. Well, what do you all think, everyone? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Are you a fan of increasing the GST? Do you think those greedy pensioners need to pay for their food? I'm getting over it. Bloody hell. As always, interact with the channel, like, comment, and subscribe. If you're a fan and want to support us that bit extra, there are a few ways you can. You can join us on YouTube or Patreon. You can support us via our affiliate links at Amazon or eBay or Independent Reserve and Kucoin. You can buy our merch from HeiseSays, use Gold Pass from the Perth Mint, or support us via PayPal. Thanks, everyone.